The late afternoon sun burned over the small town of Red River, a dusty place where wooden buildings lined the streets and the wind carried whispers of old stories. People lived hard lives here, working from dawn until dusk, and every face told a story of struggle. Among the townsfolk, one man stood out not for kindness or bravery, but for arrogance. His name was Clayton Hartman. A tall, broad-shouldered cowboy, Clayton rode the streets on a sleek horse, his boots polished and hat tilted just so. His wealth was known to everyone. He owned acres of cattle land and had more money than most people could dream of. But his wealth had given him a cruel streak. Clayton liked to show others that he was better than them, and he enjoyed making weaker people feel small. One such person was Lena Whitefeather. Lena was an Apache widow who lived on the edge of town. Her husband had died 2 years earlier, leaving her to manage a small ranch with courage and determination. She was quiet, calm, and respected the traditions of her people. But life had not been easy for her. Her ranch was modest, and she had no family in town to protect her from people like Clayton. She wore simple clothes, worked tirelessly, and rarely drew attention to herself. Yet beneath her quiet manner was a fire that no one could easily see. Clayton first noticed Lena one morning when he rode past her ranch on his way to town. He saw her tending her crops, her hands moving with skill and care, and instead of respect, he felt irritation. He could not understand why a woman, especially one of Apache heritage, would dare own land and manage it without a man to protect her. That irritation turned into amusement, and later, cruelty. He decided that Lena would be his next target for ridicule. The first incident occurred in the town square. Clayton rode in front of the small group of townsfolk gathered near the saloon. He tipped his hat and sneered. "Look at the widow Whitefeather," he said loudly. "All alone, trying to run a ranch. Can't even see how the world really works, can she?" The townsfolk murmured, some avoiding his gaze, others glancing at Lena. She was standing quietly near the market, gathering vegetables, her eyes calm but sharp. Clayton dismounted and strutted closer. "Maybe you should sell that patch of land and find someone to protect you," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Lena did not respond. She kept her head high and continued her work, ignoring him. Clayton's anger flared. He laughed loudly, drawing the attention of more townspeople. "I've seen little children run cattle better than you," he mocked. The crowd was silent, some pretending to busy themselves with chores, others unsure if they should intervene. They all knew Clayton's reputation. He was powerful and wealthy, and crossing him could bring trouble. Lena, however, refused to show fear. She straightened her back, wiped her hands on her apron, and went about her work as if he did not exist. Clayton was not used to being ignored. Most people he bullied cowered immediately. Lena's calm defiance irritated him to the core. He began spreading rumors about her, whispering to other ranchers that she was unfit to manage her land, that her crops would fail, and that her late husband's death must have been her fault somehow. He wanted the town to doubt her, to make her life harder, and for a while, it seemed to work. Some neighbors avoided her, fearing Clayton's wrath. Even the storekeepers hesitated when she came to buy supplies, casting nervous glances at the cowboy who often watched from the shadows. Despite the pressure, Lena did not falter. She worked harder, rising before sunrise to tend her fields and caring for her few livestock. She studied Clayton from a distance, observing his routines, his interactions with the townsfolk, and the way he ran his ranch. She realized that while he was powerful and rich, he was careless in some areas, depending too much on his wealth to protect him. Clayton never noticed the small details, and those details would later become crucial. Life continued this way for weeks. Clayton attempted subtle acts of sabotage. One morning, he ordered his hired men to trample part of Lena's field while she was away. They did not think she would notice. But Lena, patient and observant, had seen them from a distance and led her animals away just in time. The damage was minimal, But Clayton's arrogance did not allow him to stop. He became bolder, mocking her publicly, challenging her in town meetings, and trying to buy her land for a fraction of its worth. Each attempt failed, and each failure only strengthened Lena's resolve. The townsfolk began to notice her courage. Though many were hesitant to speak up against Clayton, they could not help but admire Lena's determination. She carried herself with dignity, never lowering herself to insults or threats. Even when Clayton tried to provoke her, her actions were quiet but effective. She repaired the minor damages he caused, protected her livestock, and continued to thrive on her land. People started to whisper that perhaps Clayton was not as invincible as he seemed. One evening, after a particularly harsh day in town, Lena returned to her ranch to find her fence damaged and her crops slightly trampled. She knew immediately that Clayton had sent his men. She did not panic or rush to confront him. Instead, she studied the damage, measured the effect, and quietly made plans to prevent future attacks. She repaired the fence stronger than before and planted new crops in a safer area. In her mind, she began thinking about how to respond not with brute force, but with careful strategy. Clayton, on the other hand, was growing frustrated. He had always relied on intimidation and wealth to get what he wanted. Lena's quiet resistance was new to him, and he did not understand it. Every plan he made to bully her seemed to fail. Every rumor he spread was ignored or disproved by her actions. He began to underestimate her at his own peril, and this arrogance would eventually be his greatest weakness. By this time, Lena had begun to understand Clayton's patterns. She noticed the times he moved cattle, the way he interacted with his workers, and the moments when he was careless. She realized that while he had strength and money, he was predictable in his arrogance, and she started thinking about the future, about how one day she could turn the situation around. For now, she remained patient, biding her time, letting Clayton exhaust himself. The town watched quietly, sensing a shift in the balance of power. Though they could not openly challenge Clayton, they began to root quietly for Lena. She represented not just herself, but the idea that courage, patience, and intelligence could resist even the most powerful oppressors. Her presence became a quiet symbol of resilience, and while Clayton mocked and threatened, he could not break her spirit. In the end, the first part of Lena's story was not one of dramatic confrontation, but of endurance and clever observation. She endured humiliation and threats with calm dignity, learned from her enemies, and quietly prepared for the moment when she could turn the tables. Clayton, blinded by arrogance and wealth, could not see the strength in the woman he sought to intimidate. The townsfolk waited with bated breath, sensing that Lena's quiet resistance was only the beginning and that the day of reckoning for the arrogant cowboy might come sooner than he expected. The hot sun rose over Red River once again, casting long shadows across the dusty streets and the surrounding fields. Lena Whitefeather had been watching Clayton Hartman for weeks, quietly studying his routines and the ways he managed his cattle empire. Clayton, for all his wealth and power, was careless in small ways that only someone paying close attention could notice. Lena, patient and clever, had begun to see patterns, weaknesses, hidden by his arrogance. She realized that his strength and influence were not as unshakable as they seemed. Clayton continued his usual routine, unaware that Lena had learned much about him. Every morning, he rode across his land, checking his cattle, and giving orders to his workers. He trusted his hired hands completely, assuming they would carry out his instructions without question. He relied on a single water source for his cattle and crops, not realizing that it was a point of vulnerability. Lena had discovered this when she carefully observed the streams and irrigation channels near both their lands. She had also noticed that Clayton often left fences weak in certain areas, assuming no one would dare cross them. For Lena, the first step in her plan was patience. She worked quietly on her ranch, making small improvements and ensuring her animals and crops were safe. She did not act rashly, knowing that revenge was not about immediate retaliation, but about precision and timing. She began speaking with other Apache families in nearby areas, carefully forming alliances without revealing her ultimate intentions. She shared nothing about Clayton directly, only learning information that could help her protect herself and her land. Clayton, meanwhile, continued to mock and belittle her whenever he had the chance. One afternoon, as Lena was repairing a fence, he rode by, tipping his hat with a smirk. "Still working that little patch of land, widow? You'll never make anything of it," he called. Lena did not look up. She smiled faintly to herself, knowing that each insult fueled her determination rather than frightening her. Clayton's arrogance blinded him to the quiet strength growing in the woman he sought to humiliate. The turning point came when Lena noticed something critical. Clayton's cattle depended on a single stream of water that ran near both of their lands. Without water, his herd could not survive, and his crops would fail. Clayton assumed he had control over it because the land around the stream was mostly his. But Lena, understanding the terrain better than anyone, realized she could influence the flow of water subtly, without causing obvious suspicion. She began with small acts of diversion. One night, she redirected some of the stream into a small channel on her land, careful not to make it obvious that anyone had tampered with it. The next day, Clayton's workers noticed slightly less water reaching his main fields. He was irritated, but dismissed it as a natural problem, unaware that Lena's careful planning was already in motion. She continued to adjust the flow gradually, enough to strain his operations but not enough to alert him immediately. In addition to the water, Lena found other weaknesses. She noticed that Clayton often drove his cattle through dangerous areas, cliffs, and rocky paths, without concern for the risk. She began creating subtle obstacles, moving rocks, and setting markers that would lead his herd into areas that caused minor injuries or slowed them down. These small disruptions frustrated Clayton, who began to lose patience and act rashly. As Lena's plan unfolded, she also used information cleverly to influence the townsfolk. She shared observations about Clayton's mismanagement with neighbors in casual conversations, careful not to make it seem like gossip or accusation. The people began to notice that Clayton's operations were not as perfect as he claimed. They saw the signs of strain and realized that the arrogant cowboy was vulnerable. Lena's quiet strategy turned the town's perception subtly against him. Clayton, sensing that something was wrong, tried to tighten control. He increased his oversight of workers, demanded stricter schedules, and rode the land more frequently. But his efforts were only partially effective. Each time he tried to assert his dominance, Lena's careful planning countered him. The water flow, the subtle obstacles, and the small misdirections had already set the stage for a larger consequence. The climax of Lena's strategy came during a particularly hot week. Clayton had scheduled a large roundup of his cattle, intending to drive them to market. Lena had timed her plan perfectly. The water had been redirected just enough to weaken some areas of his pasture. The obstacles she had created guided a portion of his herd into rocky, unsafe terrain. By the time Clayton realized what was happening, a significant number of his cattle were lost or injured, and his workers were exhausted and demoralized. Furious, Clayton rode to Lena's ranch, his anger visible to all who watched. He found her calmly tending her fields, as if nothing had happened. "You did this, didn't you?" he shouted, pointing an accusing finger. Lena looked up, her expression steady. "I did nothing that nature itself hasn't allowed," she said softly. "But I do know how to work with the land, and you have underestimated what you cannot control." Clayton was enraged. He had never been spoken to this way by anyone, let alone someone he considered weaker. The townsfolk gathered at a distance, curious to see the confrontation. For the first time, Clayton realized that his arrogance had blinded him. He had assumed that fear and wealth were enough to control everyone. Lena's intelligence, patience, and understanding of the land had undone him quietly but completely. The aftermath was visible over the following weeks. Clayton's wealth did not disappear entirely, but his cattle operations were damaged, and his influence in town diminished. People who had once feared him now saw him as vulnerable. Lena, meanwhile, flourished. Her land thrived with the careful management she had always practiced. Her crops grew stronger, her livestock healthier, and her reputation in the town grew as well. She had turned a situation of bullying and intimidation into a story of cleverness and resilience. The townsfolk began to treat Lena with respect. They saw that she had achieved victory not through violence or confrontation, but through patience, intelligence, and courage. Clayton had been shocked publicly, humbled by a woman he had thought he could control. The lesson was clear to all. Arrogance and cruelty can be defeated, but only when met with careful observation, planning, and inner strength. In the end, Lena's story became a quiet legend in Red River. Children grew up hearing about the widow who had faced the arrogant cowboy and prevailed. Her revenge was not a display of anger, but a demonstration of wisdom and resilience. Clayton learned too late that strength without understanding is fragile, and that underestimating others can lead to one's downfall. Though the town returned to its usual rhythms, the memory of Lena's courage lingered. She continued her life on her ranch, tending to her land and animals with diligence and care. Yet every once in a while, she would ride past Clayton's remaining fields with a quiet smile, a reminder that patience, intelligence, and courage can triumph over arrogance and cruelty. Lena's legacy was not built on wealth or force, but on the quiet power of resilience and careful strategy. She showed that even in a world where the strong try to dominate the weak, cleverness, courage, and respect for the land and people can turn the tables. The story of the widow and the arrogant cowboy became a tale told around fires, in saloons, and in homes. A story of justice earned not through brute strength, but through wisdom and unwavering patience.